This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today I'm bringing you another video to get you ready for the new Core Set 2020 limited format. Over the last week, I've talked about every card individually in my set review. I've talked about the archetypes in my archetype video. Today, I'm going to give you my picks for the best commons and uncommons in each color. This video is kind of a Cliff's Notes of my set review, and if you are short on time, this is a great way to prepare. Commons and uncommons will make up the vast majority of your deck in Limited, so knowing the best ones can go a long way towards helping you decide what colors to play in Sealed, and how highly you want to pick these cards in Draft. Alright, let's get started with White's best commons. I think White's third best common is Aerial Assault. So this is not a premium removal spell, which means you generally don't want to be first picking it. It isn't premium because it's situational. It only lets you destroy tapped things, which means one way or another a creature had to attack you, whether you blocked it, chump blocked it, or just took damage. That is kind of a pain, and that always sort of limits removal spells. This does have that life gain clause attached to it, but it doesn't gain you a ton of life, and frequently it'll gain you 0 life. There is a flying deck in this format. The Jeskai colors are really interested in flying, and so having 2 or 3 flyers when you play it is realistic probably. It will happen sometimes, and that does help mitigate against the fact that you've probably just taken a hit, but it's still situational. It's still a very good common, and I think you should take the first one relatively highly, but I don't really think you want multiples because it's so situational, and I don't think you ever want to first pick it in this format. Next up, we have Steadfast Sentry, who's just an efficient creature as a 3-mana 3/2 with Vigilance, and he gives you some value when he dies because he puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. Now, this set doesn't have a ton of +1/+1 counter synergy. In fact, it really doesn't have any huge payoffs for +1/+1 counters. So this effect, if you were just playing War of the Spark and you're used to +1/+1 counters really mattering, that won't really be the case here, but it's okay that it doesn't. These are good stats. It lets him attack well. It lets him block relatively well. It really won't be hard to trade with a 3/2. He has 3 power, so killing things in combat isn't that hard, and then also getting some value out of the counter. He is a solid common. I think you play, 2 to 4 of these and feel pretty good about it in most decks. I still don't think you quite want to first pick him. I think these 2 commons are both a little below first pickable range, but they are very good commons for White, and they're going to be cards. You're probably always going to want 1 Aerial Assault and a couple Steadfast Sentries in an ideal world, so, they're pretty nice cards. However, the best White common is easily first pickable, and it's actually better than most commons and uncommons in the entire set, and that is Pacifism. We've seen it a million times. It is premium removal. It gets rid of things, no questions asked, mostly. The downside it has is that a creature still has static and activated abilities. If it still has those, it doesn't shut those down. But the 2 most important things creatures can do in Limited, and maybe in any format, is attack or block. Taking those away is great. It's the kind of removal that's really good if you're the aggressor. That's part of the problem with Aerial Assault, is if you're the aggressor, it's not very good. But with Pacifism, it is good if you're the aggressor. It is good if you're the one who's a more defensive deck. And it's also splashable. And all of those things mean it is first pickable. But yeah, Pacifism, easily the best White common. Now let's move to uncommons. I think the third best White uncommon is Ancestral Blade. This is a nice piece of equipment. I really like the design on these. I like it when they can make equipment work, and I think they did it here. This is essentially a 2-mana 2/2, which is, sort of a decent baseline for a card, but it's way more flexible than that because it's a 2-mana 2/2 that, also, if say it dies, then you have Ancestral Blade left behind and you can equip it to something else. And equip 1 is a reasonable amount to pay for this stats boost. So if your creature dies, you can move it, but you can also move it before it dies onto a flyer or something that it's going to get more use out of. Ancestral Blade is a really nice uncommon for White. Right now, I have it, a little bit below where you want to first pick it, but I think you take it fairly highly because it's, especially if you're in an aggressive deck, it's going to be one of your best 2-drops in the whole format. But I wouldn't be super shocked if it overperforms. I would be really surprised if it underperforms, and maybe by the end of the format, I'll think it's first pickable. But for now, I think it's a little below that. White's next best uncommon is Angel of Vitality. A 3-mana 2/2 flyer is a nice baseline. Then it gives you some life gain payoffs. There's lots of incidental life gain in this format, and so gaining a few extra life with her is not going to be all that difficult. Getting her to be a 4/4 might be kind of difficult unless you're a really dedicated life gain deck. Thing is, life gain isn't ultra supported in this format. There are 3 payoffs for it at common and uncommon between black and white, with Angel of Vitality being one of them. But like I said, there are incidental ways to gain life. You don't really have to completely build around her to get the extra value out of her. And I do think she is first pickable. I mean, you can use gain lands and things like that, and those are going to be way better if you have Angel of Vitality. White's best uncommon is Master Splicer. This one's a reprint, and all the splicers are really good. And this is the only one we have in this set, but it is a really good one. You pay 4 mana for 5/5 worth of stats. There are also a few other golems in this set, some of which are semi-reasonable to play, and it does pump those as well, and that's pretty nice. But even on its own, it's a 4 mana 1/1 that makes a 4/4. There are also ways to abuse Into the Battlefield abilities in this format, and so if you can make more than one golem with your Splicer, you're going to be really happy. Master Splicer is really first pickable, like the kind of card, that isn't a rare or a mythic that you're really pumped to have in your opening pack. Angel of Vitality, a little bit lower than that, but still first pickable, and then Ancestral Blade's not quite there. So white uncommons and commons look pretty good. Now let's move to blue. I think the third best blue common is Sleep Paralysis. It's a lot like Aerial Assault. It's sort of the necessary removal that you're going to need if you're in blue, but it's not really premium. 4 mana to tap down a creature and keep it tapped is nice, but it's not great. It's not the removal spell you're waiting for and that you really hope you get. It's the one you play because you kind of need removal. I think you do usually probably play one of these in a blue deck because you're not going to have that much access to good removal if you're half blue. And if you're blue-green, for example, you're really not going to have good removal, in which case Sleep Paralysis moves up a little bit. But I do think the first copy of Sleep Paralysis you take reasonably high. I don't know how much you want multiple copies, again, unless you're in a color pair really light on good removal. But it is solid. It has the downsides auras have, like Pacifism. It doesn't shut down activated or triggered abilities or static abilities. Although it does shut them down, I guess, if the creature has to tap for them. But it's a solid card. So yeah, it's one of blue's best commons, but it's not quite premium, and I kind of hope I never have to first pick one. Next, we have Cloudkin Seer, a 3 mana 2/1 flyer that draws you a card when it enters the battlefield, and that is really, really good. They wrote a whole article about how they pushed commons in this set really hard for the first time in a while, and Cloudkin Seer was one example of that. We're going to see in black the other really big example of that. And Cloudkin Seer is definitely a pushed common. It's a high-ranking common in this format. It's one you first pick. So what makes it good? Well, between being an evasive threat that has semi-reasonable stats for 3 mana, obviously a 3 mana 2/1 flyer is not great, but you could do worse. But it also draws you a card, and that means it's going to be a 2-for-1 a lot of the time. You can also, again, abuse Into the Battlefield abilities in this format various ways, and if you can draw extra cards with the Cloudkin Seer, you're going to be really happy. Cloudkin Seer, definitely first pickable. Also an elemental, which does matter. That's really the only creature type that matters in this whole format. Wolves matter a little bit because of one rare, but mostly this is the creature type that matters, and it has that one, so that's good. And I sort of struggled with whether I wanted Cloudkin Seer at number 1 for blue commons or Frostlinks, which is what I put here for now. I could easily see the two of them flipping, though I am reasonably confident that they are the two best commons in blue, but I could see the Seer end up being better. The Frostlinks, like Sleep Paralysis, is a reprint. It does sort of a impression of Mana War in that it comes down, taps down one of your opponent's things, doesn't bounce it, but it does make it so your opponent has one creature that just can't block for 2 separate combats. And sometimes when you do that, it is backbreaking. It'll be especially effective in like a Flyers deck where you're playing Cloudkin Seer and other Flyers. Maybe your opponent has a creature with Reach or one of their own Flyers. You tap that down and suddenly you attack for a lot. He is best in aggressive decks because it only stops an attack once, which isn't the most valuable thing to do if you're trying to slow your opponent down in a more controlling deck, but it's still fine there. But Frostlinks is going to be really powerful. It has been every time we've seen it. And for now, I do think it's blue's best common, but I'm not super confident it will outdo Cloudkin Seer by the end of this format. So that'll be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. Next up, we have blue's uncommons. I think the third best uncommon is Yarok's Wavecrasher. Now, as people pointed out, in my set review, I sort of overlooked the fact that it says return another creature you control to its owner's hand. I sort of saw the fact that it wasn't a May clause and just assumed it had to bounce your Yarok's Wavecrasher, but that is not what it does. You don't have to return something if you don't have something. You do, however, have to return something if you have other creatures in play because it isn't a May clause, and that is a little bit of a downside. But the Wavecrasher is still a 4 mana 4/4, which is a stat line that is really, really good and limited. And it's one of those cards that helps you abuse those Into the Battlefield abilities I was talking about. It's also good against auras like Pacifism and Sleep Paralysis because you can return the creature that has that attached to it to your hand. I think it just seems like you can get a lot of value out of Yarok's Wavecrasher. He does have a bit of a downside. Again, you do have to bounce something if you have another creature. You have to do it. You don't have a choice. And I think that holds him a little bit below first pickable range. But if it turns out this effect is really, really good in this format, and it may very well end up that way, he may move into first pickable range. I don't have him way below it or anything. Next up, we have Warden of Avos Isle, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer that reduces the cost of your flying creatures. That's pretty great. This format has a flying theme we already mentioned. This already has a nice baseline of stats as a 3-mana 2/2. And really, making your 4-drop, 5-drop flyers cost less is significant. And I think that makes it definitely a first pickable card. There's just so many flyers in this set. I can't really see going wrong. Even if you don't end up with other flyers, you at least have a passable card, right? And I think Blue's best uncommon is a rather unexciting one, and it's frequently been Blue's best uncommon when we've seen it, and it's Air Elemental. It's just a 5-mana 4/4 flyer, but those stats are legit. I mean, you don't get stats like that in Limited very often, which is crazy because this card goes all the way back to Alpha. There aren't a lot of cards today that, if they're printed in a Limited format, are still really good. Serra Angel, is one of those. Air Elemental is too. I just think it's a great creature, and I think you first pick it a significant percentage of the time when you do see it. All right, now let's move to black. I think black's third best common is Gorging Vulture. So yet another creature with flying, yet another 3-mana 2/2 flyer. We've seen several of those on this list already. This one doesn't have quite as much usefulness as the other ones we've talked about, but it does do things. You get to put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. There are some black decks in this format that will have enough ways to do things with their graveyard that'll just be upside. But it also gains you life, which is also a little bit of upside, and it works well with some of the life gain payoffs that we've already seen one of those, and we're actually going to see another in a minute. So those things are nice. It's a nice evasive creature. Nothing special, and I don't think it's really, I think it's the weakest third best common we've had in this video so far. But, it's a solid playable. Next up, I have Agonizing Siphon. So this thing is not the most efficient spell in the world. It's Lightning Helix, that's sorcery speed for twice as much mana. But sort of like Sleep Paralysis, sort of like Aerial Assault, it's the kind of common removal spell that is going to be a necessary evil a lot of the time because you're not going to be able to get all the most awesome removal spells ever. And you'll play like one Agonizing Siphon, maybe even 2 in most of your decks if you need to. It's nice that it gains you life. That might make it most well suited to a control deck who sort of simultaneously gets to trade with a card and gain life, which is really powerful against aggressive decks. And it's nice that it can go to the dome for aggressive decks because it may give you a little bit of reach. It is clunky, but it does the job, and I think it's a pretty high-ranking common. I don't think you want to first pick it, though. However, black's best common is one of the best cards in the entire set. It's one of the best cards regardless of rarity, regardless of color. There aren't that many mythics and rares that outrank this common. That's how good it is. And that also means you're probably almost never going to see it, at least early, unless you open it. And that's Murder. 3 mana, destroy something, no questions asked, is incredibly powerful and limited. It does have a mana cost that makes it hard to splash, but that's okay. It has to have some downside. If everyone could splash Murder, this format would be a nightmare. So, yeah, Murder, great removal spell, easily first pickable. 95% of the time, maybe, when you see Murder, it's probably just what you should take out of the pack. So that's just how good it is. So black's uncommons. I think the third best black uncommon is Gravedigger. This is another card we've seen a million times. 4 mana for a 2/2 that gets you a creature back from your graveyard is really good. It allows him to 2 for 1 a lot. You can also have him get in the graveyard and then get him back with a way to return him to your hand and then cast it again and get the enter the battlefield trigger again. He's just always going to give you great value. He used to be printed at common all the time, and he was frequently one of black's best commons, usually below like a premium removal spell. And even as an uncommon, he still makes it onto these lists. I think every time he's been printed lately, I've had him on these lists because he's just that good. He really helps you grind out wins, and that's what's great about Gravedigger. Next up, we have Bloodthirsty Aerialist. This is the other life gain build around I mentioned a minute ago, and it's a much better one than the Angel. A 3 mana 2/3 flyer as a baseline is really good, and it has a better payoff for gaining life because it just straight up gets +1/+1 counters. And the reason I have it here, maybe it seems a little bit like a build around, but the reason I have it here is if you just get 1 counter on this, you're going to really feel like you're in business, especially because the baseline's a 3 mana 2/3 flyer. And if you can get more than that on her, she's going to be insane. I really don't think it'll be that hard in a black deck to get 5 ways to gain life. We saw Agonizing Siphon, for example. There are plenty of other commons and uncommons that do that. There are gain lands. Playing a gain land and getting to put a counter on this is going to be one of the most sort of sweet things you can do in this format. Just something that seems like some really serious value. To get a counter out of a land drop is pretty serious. So yeah, Bloodthirsty Aerialist and Gravedigger, all 3 black uncommons, as we'll see, are first pickable the majority of the time when you see them. But Disfigure is the best of the bunch. It's another premium removal spell. You always trade up with it. You know, you're paying 1, so it's going to be hard for you not to be trading up and making your opponent come out behind on mana by killing their 4 mana creature that's like a 4/2 or whatever with Disfigure. It giving minus stats instead of damage also makes it a little more flexible than your typical damage removal spell, because you can set up blocks that help kill it while also keeping your creatures alive as you weaken it with Disfigure. So yeah, Disfigure is great. All 3 of Black's uncommons are really good. That's the first time we've had all 3 uncommons in this video so far be things I'm happy to first pick. So that's something to keep in mind about Black. It was a little more shallow at common though than the other colors, so it probably evens out. Next we've got Red, where I think the 3rd best common is another card sort of continuing the theme of removal that you'll play, but that is not the best removal that you really want and you don't really want to first pick, and that's Reduce to Ashes. It does the job. It kills big creatures, it exiles them, so if they have death triggers or your opponent has ways to get things back from their graveyard, it deals with that. But it is clunky. At 5 mana to do 5 to something, that's not exactly the efficiency you want. But I think your first copy of this should be valued pretty highly. You know, again, not a first pick, but valued pretty highly. It doesn't hurt that you can splash it. So if you're like in a green deck and you're desperate for removal, this is a nice thing to splash because it does the job. Chandra's Outrage is a much better removal spell. It costs 1 less, and it does instant speed 4 damage, and that's a significant difference. And on top of that, it also does 2 damage to your opponent. So that's some nice additional value you get out of Chandra's Outrage, and I do think you can first pick Outrage. Then there's also Shock, a premium removal spell, 1 red to do 2 to anything. It's a lot like Disfigure, except it does damage, which in some ways is less flexible because you can't set up blocks that like make it so your creatures survive and you weaken theirs. But it can go to the dome, and that probably is sort of makes Disfigure and Shock pretty close to one another in value. Red's uncommons, I think the 3rd best one is Rapacious Dragon, you know, a relatively large flyer that also gives you treasure tokens. That means he can serve as a win condition in the air. That means that he can allow you to splash relatively easily, and I think 3-color decks in this format are going to be a thing relatively often. And Rapacious Dragon definitely helps you enable that. And those things combined make him a pretty efficient creature for what he is. He's a card in my set review that I said, you know, I'm starting him, you know, at a C+, as I said, which means a little bit below first pickable. But I wouldn't be surprised to see it move up. You know, last time we saw Treasure, all the cards with it were a little better than I expected them to be, basically. And maybe Rapacious Dragon gets there, too. Next up, I have Ember Hauler, a nice little 2-mana 2/2 that can sack itself to do 2 to anything. It's nice for aggressive decks early. It's nice for any deck, really. And it can go to the dome later. So Ember Hauler is pretty great. And the best red uncommon is Chandra, Novice Pyromancer, who is really, really powerful. She's the only Planeswalker red uncommon in this set, so it shouldn't be too much of a shock to see her show up here. I think most of her power, most often, is going to come from her -2 ability. If you can pay 4, bring her into play, kill one thing one turn, kill another thing another turn, it'll feel a lot like Jaya Ballard from the last set, except she actually costs 1 less. And she can also do it to your opponent. So sometimes your opponent will be at 4 and she can just end the game. She's got some elemental synergy too. That is the only creature type in this format that really matters. I guess goblins actually matters a little bit too. Earlier I forgot to mention them. But they're not super well supported the way elementals are. She pumps all your elementals if you need her to, and she can raise her loyalty in doing so. And she has a -1 that helps you ramp as well. She's just really flexible. Honestly, if all she had was that -2 ability and was 4 mana for a 5 loyalty planeswalker, I think she'd still be one of the best uncommons in the set. With all the other stuff on top of it, she may be the best uncommon in the set. The question is she better than Murder, which is a common? So that's kind of a weird question, but it really might just be that Murder's better than her, but she is incredibly good. And you first pick her almost every time you see her, and she is splashable, and that is a valuable thing. All right, so our last color is green, of course. I think the 3rd best green common is Leafkin Druid. You know, this is mostly a 2-mana 0/3 that taps to add green. Sometimes in the late game, you'll get a bunch of extra mana from it, or not a bunch, but 1 more extra mana from it, and that might be nice for mana sinks and stuff, but 4 or more creatures, by the time you're there, how much do you really want to add 2 green mana? Probably not all that often, but it is a mana dork, and I have a hard time not liking those. I think, you know, being able to help you play things early is great, helping you get things out earlier, and it's actually a reasonable blocker for a card that also has all these other abilities, namely the ability to add green mana, and it's also an elemental, which does matter. Next up, we have Silverback Shaman, which feels to me like another pretty pushed common. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if this was an uncommon. 5 mana 5/4 trample is already a pretty decent card in Limited, but when it dies, you draw a card. So what this means is Silverback Shaman on his own is kind of a threat. Your opponent can't chump block it. They probably have to block it in sort of an ugly way or trade with it. And anytime they're trading with it, you're coming out ahead because he draws you a card. That means you're getting a 2-for-1, and that makes Silverback Shaman really strong. The one problem it has is at 5, there may be decks that either don't want too many 5-drops or some that don't even want them at all. But I think this is a great thing to have at the top of your curve. I think it's probably the best 5-drop for green at common or uncommon in this format. And so, it depends what your other color is, but it probably won't be that hard to get him into your deck. And I do think he is also worth first picking. Then there's also Rabid Bite, a reprint, a removal spell that lets your creatures, like your Silverback Shaman, do damage equal to their power to your opponent's creature, one of their creatures. So this is also a premium removal spell. Pretty much every color has one at common, except blue, I guess. It is situational. You have to be a little careful with it. If you target your Silverback Shaman and your opponent kills it in response, you're sort of getting 2-for-1. I guess because the Silverback Shaman draws you a card, it's not the end of the world. But on most other creatures, if you target it with this and your opponent kills it, you're in a world of hurt because of the 2-for-1. But for 2 mana, it's going to let you destroy lots and lots of things. Green just has big creatures, and it's not going to be that hard for them to find ways to kill things with Rabid Bite. Be careful with it, but when you can play it, when there's a good opening where your opponent can't interact, it's going to be really powerful, and it's a great removal spell. All 3 of these commons I think you should first pick, so that's pretty deep on commons for green. So now let's move to green's uncommons. I think the third best uncommon is Howling Giant. It may cost 7, but I think green decks are going to be interested in playing some high drops. Like 1 7-drop in your deck is probably going to be a good call, especially one that's this powerful, who gives you 9/9 worth of stats for only 7 mana. He's also got reach, so he helps shut down flyers. He helps you go wide. He has an Into the Battlefield ability. He just overlaps with so many different decks in this format. The ones that can abuse Into the Battlefield abilities, the ones that can go wide, and like ramp control decks where he's a nice finisher. And I think for that reason, he's a pretty nice first pick. I do think you kind of probably don't want more than 1 unless you really end up with a ton of removal, because 7's still a lot of mana. But I think the first one should be taken pretty highly. He's going to be a great card to help you close out games or stabilize or whatever. When you can play him, he's going to have a massive impact. Next up, I have Thrashing Brontodon, a reprint. 3 mana, 3/4 is great stats, and one thing I really like about this is that it gives you a main board way to play destroy target artifact or enchantment effects. It doesn't feel horrible sometimes. If you main board a naturalize effect, there are going to be tons of games where you either have completely useless targets for it or no targets at all. Thrashing Brontodon gives you a nice efficient creature who you can like Rabid Bite with and things like that, who can attack well, who can block well. And then, if it so happens that your opponent plays a Pacifism or something, the Brontodon can deal with it, and that's pretty nice. Brontodon also first pickable. I think the best green uncommon is Barkhide Troll. It's a 2 mana 3/3 essentially. He is one of the few cards in the set that can do things with +1/+1 counters. So we talked earlier about that card that puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature when it dies. Barkhide Troll can actually get some extra value out of that because he can gain hexproof by removing a counter. The fact that it can be hexproof means also this is a good place to maybe do sort of riskier things, like maybe Rabid Bite if your opponent has mana untapped, or combat tricks or auras. Obviously, if you run out of counters on him, he's not going to be hexproof anymore or be able to become hexproof anymore. But it's a pretty great baseline to be a 2 mana 3/3 that can gain hexproof and take some advantage of +1/+1 counters. So those are my picks for the best commons and uncommons in Core Set 2020. Let me know in the comments if you think there's some I left out or some I'm overrating or underrating. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to make sure you catch future limited reviews, more limited content, including Core Set 2020 draft videos, which should be starting maybe the day this video is coming out, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.